Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I just say I'm very, very grateful to be here. My association with Leeds has been a very, very long one in the very, very early 80s. And can I thank the whole organizing committee for putting this event together. It's absolutely splendid. What I want to do today is just to share some views around the impact that the built and natural environments have on health and well-being. Of course, I'm sure yesterday we've talked quite a lot about climate change. I wasn't there. And of course, what people say these days, you can't do a keynote speech without using the T word and the B word, the Trump word and the Brexit word. Yes? hopefully I wouldn't get into that bandwagon. Suffice to say that I just want to share thoughts around how we might begin to tackle some of these very, very complex areas around the built environment, the natural environment, how they impact on our health and our well-being. And I want to start by putting forward some assumptions that will help me move forward in this presentation. I take the view that the world in which we live in is a very complex world. And at times, man here is a pluralistic word to mean man and woman, so forgive me if I use the phrase man in what I say. Man is at times at war with nature and himself, I have to say. And at times, it appears as if nature is at war with man. We only need to look at what has transpired in the last 1 week. We look at the hurricane in the Americas, the Caribbean, the Florida. We look at what's happening in Nepal. We look at what's happening in some parts of Nigeria. And we stand almost helpless with these super force coming from nature. And at times you sit and say, you know what? No matter what you do, this will just happen. You feel so infinitesimally small when you are confronted with the brutal force of nature. But I take the view that the input that humans offer in nature also contributes to some of the things we are facing. I also take the view that the natural and built environment interact in a very, very complex way. In a way which I called gives us a wicked problem. In 1973, there were two writers, Eitel and Heifeld, who introduced the concept of a wicked problem. And I think we are facing a wicked problem. I also take a construction ontological perspective that says we cannot make sense of this wicked problem, these issues of how built environment and natural environment impacts on us, without making sense of the actors, i.e. those who live in it, you and I, and the interventions which we want to put forward to make sense of it. So we cannot look at everything in isolation of the other. And I argue that there's no one best solution. Finally, I want to put forward the view that we need to use a functional and integrated approach. By functional approach, I take the view that every activity, every function we find ourselves in is an opportunity to give us leverage to intervene in a positive way. And within that construct, I talk about the issue of responsibility and accountability. So we don't just stay and say, well, it's beyond me, it's the force of nature. So I say that as a functional proposition. And there's an integrated approach, which I argue to say we need to come together in almost everything we do. So I'll talk about the built environment, impact of health, the complex wicked problem, functional approach, and holistic approach. We know what the built environment is, the man-made surroundings that we live in, and the humanitarian man-made space in which we live in. I like this phrase by Winston Churchill. He said, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. And I think that's what happens. We're impacted by the built environment in which we live. And of course, the natural environment, we are all familiar with it. We go and see what happens. the living and non-living things that occur naturally, they interact with what we do, the species, the climate, the weather, the natural resources that affect what we do. And of course, when you begin to look at them, you look at air quality, pollution, how we all contribute towards pollution and what that does to the health of the society. We'll talk about climate change and the increasing movement around the temperature gradient. We'll look at humidity, noise pollution, light. Light we take for granted in the developed world. When you look at the developing world, you begin to see that many, many millions of people haven't got regular supply of light and supply of energy, and the impact that has on health and well-being. And of course, safety, space, and accessibility. I believe that there is something called climate change. And I know there are those who don't believe. And I can respect that in a way. Why? Because we're looking at a wicked problem. And at times there's a confusion along the boundaries of our ontological position, how we view reality. And of course, there are areas where, yes, there are evidence-based to allow us to make decisions. And there are areas where the evidence is not so much convincing. And again, that's what you get in a wicked, complex solution. There are mega trends. People are moving into cities in big ways. In fact, we are beginning to see mega cities and cities where you cannot even have a terminology for. There is the view in China and in India that there will be cities of 120 million people. Cities bigger than the UK 2 times over. Just imagine what that means in terms of the built environment and the impact. And of course, we see lots of technologies, smart technologies. We see the Internet of Things. We see big data analytics. And what is frightening is that when you project 20 years from now, you notice that 50% of all new construction will be in China and India. And then you begin to look at one particular project in China, which is called the One Road, One Belt construction. That the Chinese people want to find a way of linking to other parts of Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. It's going to impact on 4.6 billion people. That is staggering. I'm not sure how you can construct such a project without having an impact on the world we live. And yes, look at that statistic. Suicide and mental health issue in construction is 63 times higher than the nearest sector. This is frightening. It is absolutely. But that's the real world we live in. We are all here, and we don't seem to appreciate what happens on construction sites. The welfare, the well-being, because of what we do and what we don't do. Yes, we know that the temperature is rising. I believe we're seeing the effect. There are those who will contend otherwise. Temperature is going up, and some of what's going up cannot be explained through natural processes. But when you look at what this means in our day-to-day lives, climate change affecting regional weather, heat waves, temperature, precipitation, you look at the influences, what that means in terms of contamination pathway, especially when you see the flood carrying pathogens, and what that means to the health of the nations, not just those who are affected here and now, but how it impacts on the neighbors around. The transmission dynamics of pathogens. And of course, what that means agriculturally and the food we eat, and the socioeconomic demographic as we all move around the world. It is frightening. It is very frightening. And of course, when you look at some of the data sets coming from the World Health Organization saying that when you look at water quality and quantity, contributing to doubling of people living in water-stressed basins by 2050. Food security, especially in Asia and Africa, an issue we need to tackle. Control of infectious diseases. I once did a research project to look at the impact that facilities management play on reducing healthcare-acquired infections in the hospitals, working with clinicians, where you go to the hospital and the spatial differentiation between one bed and another, the cleanliness, the ventilation, the HVAC, and how pathogens transmit. It's often said that whatever is above the bed, it's the responsibility of the clinicians, and everything below the bed, the cleaning and all that stuff, is the facilities management. But the coming together of these two professionals help us to address this very important area. Protections from disaster, and of course, when you look at what's going on, some of the largest diseases burden are climate sensitive. You look at malaria and you look at the Anopheles mosquitoes, and because of how we manage our habitat, kills 3.5 million people a year, and it dwarfs what we say in terms of the hurricane. And we'll look at summer heat waves. We look at hurricane. This is frightening. And of course, you look at how all these are linked to poverty. Imagine you watch the television and you see people in Asia with kids, with older people going through flood, some of them injured, the skin exposure. These are some of the things that the built environment and natural environment bring together. And I ask the question, how do we tackle this? And of course, it varies from place to place. I take the view that it's a wicked problem. And what's a wicked problem? These are problems that are difficult to clearly define. They are problems that have lots of coming together of variables, very multifaceted. And at times, in trying to deal with one aspect, they have unforeseen consequences, and they're very unstable. You can't really get your hand on them. No clear solutions, socially complex, and it involves more than one agency. And of course, to make sense of it, we need to change our behaviors. And at times, we have what I call conflicting policy formulation and interventions. So they are really, really complex. But I think when we begin to use a functional approach and say, look, you know what, it looks big, but let's look at what I do as a project manager, as a facilities manager, as a quantity surveyor in my work, the decisions I make, how I contribute to the project life cycle, how I am involved in making decisions on how to procure materials, my role in looking at modern day slavery. For example, I had the opportunity of working in Qatar, and I see modern slavery at its best. Are with me? People there being paid pittance, put in very, very squalid positions, and they are working in heat of 50 degrees Celsius. Absolutely, and we can make decisions around that. We need to look at impact and result orientation in what we do. And we shouldn't always look at things and say, I can't intervene, it can intervene. The immediacy and localism, where we are part of, we should be doing something. And yes, I believe we need to take individual responsibility and accountability. Now is as good as any time. It's not something for the next generation, or, oh, I'm leaving the organization in 5 years, somebody else will come and just deal with it. The orientation, the behavioral positioning, I think is absolutely right. And every little thing counts. Look at that. These environments still exist. Just look at that environment and say, how can one live in there for more than 1 week without contracting one illness? Just look at what she's doing there. There's a pot there with chicken inside. Oh yeah, she has to feed herself for starters. It's unbelievable. It exists. We have a role, whether at the planning position, where the planning we put forward, which affects the neighborhood we live in, our housing design, what we do in terms of traffic density, how that impacts on our water quality. All this have an impact. And if you look at the OECD countries, you notice that environmental damage, what we do to our environment, is responsible for 2.6% of the total burden of diseases. This is in the developed world, not just the developing country. And interesting, when you look at what Margaret Chan said in 2009, the World Health Organization Director General says sustainable urban transport could cut heart disease and stroke by up to 20%. Improved stoves for cooking in places like India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, just using stove than the very traditional way, can reduce warming from black carbon. And health benefits from actions to reduce greenhouse gas emission could substantially offset mitigation costs. And I say to myself, even the individual actions of our living in our homes could play a major impact in the world we live in. And of course, I've been privileged to do some research to find out that the design of the built environment can improve educational achievement in schools and can also improve the recovery of patients in hospitals. How our architect put the design together, how we as constructors construct the buildings and the ambience and the environment of the building can play a role in the health and well-being of people. And of course, in this day and age of heightened security and crime, the way we look at our neighborhoods, the way we plan and design them, both in terms of their aesthetics and their functionality, should support us in addressing some of these risk issues. I think it's an integrated approach. Governance has a role to play. Governance at the very highest level, at the local community level, has a role to play. Good policies that take account of the society plays a role. I play a role in the CIOB, and at this moment we are putting in place some policy formulation on how to work with the government so that their policies on the built environment is highly informed and impactful. And I think it's important at that level we should be working. And professionalism and ethics. We are all professionals. How we view our world, how we take responsibility, the leadership, the consideration of things from a long-term point of view as well as from a short-term point of view plays a role. And technological advancements is a two-edged sword. Yes, we can see how they contribute to improving humanity and improving productivity and efficiency, but because it's a complex issue, it also has some negative impact. And we are seeing the negative impact in terms of security breaches, and we need to manage that. And again, the lack of equity and fairness in the circular flow of money and economic considerations is a big issue when you look at the North and South divide and how we tackle climate change. And so is the demand, our needs and wants and expectations. We also have to have checks and balances. So we're not left carrying on growing and improving. There needs to be checks and balances. Over and above what I call the natural selection, there needs to be checks and balances. And the places and spaces we live in, it's important. So we need to look at things from a more holistic approach, look at innovations and flexibility, and there will be compromises. There will be compromises as we look at this. And we need to look at different agencies that allow us to push some of these things forward. And we should be able to challenge and ask people to be accountable at every level in which we operate. And we should encourage that debate, even at the higher education level and even below. And I also say the citizenry need to play a role in what we do. Behavioral change is important. And the tolerance of risk and uncertainty in what we do. This latter strategic positioning looks very, very contradictory. But at times you use contradictory policy formulation to tackle what I call wicked problems. An authoritative strategic positioning where it seems as if it's being imposed at times can be good when you want to be efficient and time is of the essence. And at times when you want to get innovation, the best, a competitive strategic approach is good. And of course, the notion of collaboration, bringing in the best brain and taking account of everyone is important. I just want to end with this slide to say the issues are multifaceted. They are wicked. They appear contradictory. And we need to use different solutions. It involves people, processes, and governance. And we have a role to play. And we need to start now. And no matter what we think we are doing, if it's positive, it should contribute to the bigger whole. There needs to be ethical standards. There needs to be professionalism brought to bear. There needs to be accountability. And our planners and the entire integrated delivery should consider public health. And as educators, we need to begin to look at these things from a very, very complex point of view. We need to introduce systems thinking to our students to understand the interwoven nature of this. But above all, I need to say that responsibility, accountability, and starting now, it's so important. More important now than ever before. Thank you very much.
Thank you.